Imagine a man so powerful that the entire city of Chicago feared his name, yet so beloved by the poor that they called him a saint. Imagine someone who ran a billion-dollar criminal empire, shook hands with politicians, hosted lavish parties for celebrities, and then was brought down not by a bullet, not by a rival gangster, but by a simple tax form. This is the real story of Alphonse Gabriel Capone, the most notorious gangster in American history and one of the most fascinating human beings who ever lived. Al Capone was born on January 17, 1899, in Brooklyn, New York, to Italian immigrant parents who came to America with nothing but hope. His father was a barber, his mother sewed fabric in a factory. They were decent, hard-working people trying to survive in a country that did not exactly welcome them with open arms. Brooklyn in the early 1900s was rough, overcrowded, and unforgiving. Italian immigrants were treated as second-class citizens. They faced discrimination, poverty, and limited opportunities. The streets, however, offered a different kind of education, one that rewarded toughness, loyalty, and street intelligence over anything a classroom could teach. Capone dropped out of school at age 14 after hitting a teacher. That single moment, impulsive, violent, and irreversible, set the direction of the rest of his life. One of the most iconic things about Al Capone is the 3 scars on his left cheek. The story behind them is surprisingly ordinary for a man of his legend. As a young man working as a bouncer and waiter at a small club, Capone made an inappropriate comment to a woman. Her brother, Frank Galluccio, pulled out a knife and slashed Capone across the face 3 times before anyone could stop him. Capone never retaliated. In fact, he later employed Galluccio as a bodyguard, a strange but telling decision that showed Capone's complex personality. The press called him Scarface. Capone reportedly hated that nickname. He preferred to be called Snorky, a slang term at the time meaning someone who dressed sharply. And dress sharply he did. Custom suits, diamond rings, silk ties, and a fedora hat became his signature. He understood that appearance was power. In 1920, the United States government made one of the most catastrophic policy decisions in its history. It banned alcohol. This was called prohibition, and it was supposed to clean up American society. Instead, it handed organized crime the greatest business opportunity in history. When alcohol became illegal, people did not stop drinking. They just started buying it illegally. Someone had to supply that demand, and Al Capone, by his late 20s, was running the largest illegal alcohol supply network in the country. His operation in Chicago was staggering in scale. He controlled over 10,000 speakeasies, illegal bars hidden behind fake storefronts, barbershops, and bookstores. He had breweries, distilleries, distribution trucks, and a network of corrupt police officers and politicians on his payroll. Estimates suggest his organization was generating around $60 million a year at its peak, which, adjusted for inflation, is roughly $1 billion in today's money. He was not just a criminal. He was a CEO of a shadow corporation operating inside a major American city in broad daylight. On February 14, 1929, Valentine's Day, 7 members of a rival gang were lined up against a garage wall in Chicago and executed. The killers were dressed as police officers. The public was horrified. The newspapers screamed. The entire country demanded action. Nobody could prove Capone ordered it. He was in Florida at the time, conveniently far from Chicago. But everyone knew. The massacre became a turning point, not just in Capone's story, but in American public opinion. Before that day, many people saw Capone as a colorful, larger-than-life figure. After it, the federal government made taking him down a national priority. President Herbert Hoover reportedly told his law enforcement agencies, "Get Capone, whatever it takes."
Here's the part of Capone's story that almost sounds like a dark comedy. The most feared gangster in America, a man responsible for murders, bribery, and a criminal empire, was eventually convicted of tax evasion. The federal government assigned a special team of investigators led by Elliot Ness and a group known as the Untouchables to build a case against Capone. Ness went after the bootlegging operation. He raided warehouses, seized trucks, and caused real financial damage. But making a criminal case stick on Capone proved almost impossible. Witnesses disappeared, juries got bribed, and evidence vanished. The IRS, however, found a different angle. Capone had made millions, but he had never filed a tax return. He did not even have a bank account in his name. Everything was in cash. The government argued that regardless of how the money was earned, it was still income, and income required taxes. In 1931, Al Capone was convicted of 5 counts of tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. He was also fined massively and ordered to pay back taxes. It was a humiliating end for a man who had once seemed untouchable. Capone was sent to the newly opened Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary in 1934, the island prison in San Francisco Bay designed specifically for the most dangerous and high-profile criminals. There were no privileges, no special treatment, and no way to bribe your way to comfort. Inside Alcatraz, something far worse than prison was happening to Capone. He had contracted syphilis years earlier and never properly treated it. By the time he reached Alcatraz, the disease had begun attacking his brain. His mental state deteriorated rapidly. Guards and fellow inmates noted that the man who once commanded an army of criminals now struggled to hold basic conversations. He was released in 1939 after serving 7.5 years, not as a free man returning to power, but as a sick, mentally diminished shadow of his former self. Capone retired to his Palm Island estate in Miami, Florida. He spent his last years fishing, playing cards, and receiving visits from family. His mind never fully recovered. He was, by most accounts, living at roughly the mental level of a young child in his final years. On January 25, 1947, just 8 days after his 48th birthday, Al Capone died of cardiac arrest, with pneumonia as a complicating factor. He died quietly, surrounded by family, in his warm Florida home. Not in a blaze of gunfire, not in a dramatic final standoff, just gone. Al Capone's life is not just a gangster story. It is a story about what happens when poverty, opportunity, ambition, and a deeply flawed system collide. It is a story about how one man can expose the hypocrisy of an entire nation. Because Capone did not create the demand for alcohol, America did. He simply answered it. And in the end, the empire built on fear, money, and violence crumbled, not with a bang, but with a tax bill.